With coal-stained hands clutching a royal ring, she entered the palace as a maid, never imagining she'd leave as a queen. Cora Lowen spent her days in the suffocating darkness of the palace coal cellars, invisible to the glittering world above. But when King Alastair announced a trial of merit to find a consort who truly understood his people's struggles, Cora made a dangerous choice. Armed with a stolen gown, forbidden knowledge of the palace's secret tunnels, and a mysterious diamond ring she'd guarded her entire life, she stepped out of the shadows and into the light. What she didn't know was that the soot on her hands would become her greatest weapon, the ring on her finger would threaten her life, and the lonely king above would see past her disguise to the queen she was always meant to be. Before we begin, I need to know, where are you listening from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments because I love seeing how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when a coal-covered maid with a forbidden ring steps into a world that was never meant for her. What you're about to witness is the ultimate globe, a journey from coal dust to crown jewels, from invisible servant to high queen. But this isn't just about a transformation, it's about the secrets that make it dangerous, the ring that could cost her everything, and a king who won't see the truth coming until it's too late. This is survival, scandal, and a revolution wrapped in silk and soot. So settle in, because we're about to descend into the darkest cellars of the Ivory Peaks, where Cora's impossible journey begins, and trust me, by the time we reach the throne room, nothing will ever be the same. The sound of the bells reached even the coal cellars, a cascading peal that shook dust from the ancient stone ceiling. Cora paused mid-shovel, her blackened hand still gripping the handle as the reverberations rolled through her chest like thunder. Above her, she could hear the sudden rush of footsteps, the excited chatter of the kitchen staff abandoning their posts to flood into the courtyards. "Royal announcement," muttered Bess, her fellow coalmaid, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist. "Probably another tax. Another reason to bleed us dry." But something in Cora's gut twisted with a different intuition. She set down her shovel and moved toward the narrow ventilation shaft that connected their underground world to the palace above. Through the iron grating, she could just make out the edge of the grand balcony where King Alastair himself stood, resplendent in midnight blue velvet, his crown catching the afternoon sun like captured fire. His voice carried down through the shaft, clear and resonant. "I announce a trial of merit, a 3-day competition open to all unmarried women of the realm, noble or common. I seek not a bride chosen by bloodline, but a consort who understands the struggles of our people, who possesses both wisdom and courage." Cora's breath caught. Open to all. Even her. The thought was dangerous, intoxicating, impossible. She was still clutching the grating when she heard the commotion behind her, a sharp cry of pain that snapped her back to the suffocating present. She spun to see Ilara, her best friend since childhood, crumpled on the stone floor, her arm twisted at an unnatural angle. Standing over her was Guard Captain Thorne, his face twisted with contempt. "Clumsy wretch," he spat. "You spilled coal dust on my boots." "It was an accident." Cora rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside Ilara, whose face had gone white with pain. She tripped on the uneven floor. "You know these stones are treacherous." Thorne's boot came down inches from Ilara's injured arm. "Accidents have consequences. 10 lashes, and her rations cut in half for a month. She'll starve." The words tore from Cora's throat before she could stop them. The guard's eyes narrowed. Then perhaps she should have been more careful. He turned on his heel and strode toward the stairs, leaving them in the ash-heavy darkness. Cora held Ilara as her friend wept silently, biting down on her own sleeve to muffle the sound. This was their world, invisible, disposable, crushed beneath boots they'd polished themselves. Above them, the king spoke of merit and understanding, while down here, they were punished for the crime of existing. That was the moment Cora's hands stopped trembling. The diamond ring hidden beneath her coal-stained glove seemed to burn against her skin, a reminder of the secret she'd carried her entire life. If the king truly wanted someone who understood suffering, then she would show him. She would enter his trial, not for love or glory, but for Ilara. For every invisible soul breaking their backs beneath the palace's gleaming floors. She would change this system from the inside. Or die trying. The palace laundry operated in permanent twilight, a cavernous space where steam rose like ghosts and the scent of lye soap burned the back of Cora's throat. She had exactly 7 minutes before the head laundress returned from delivering the Duchess of Thornfield's chemises, 7 minutes to commit the theft that would either save her or destroy her. Her eye scanned the endless rows of hanging garments, silks and satins in jewel tones that seemed to glow even in the dim light. Most belonged to women who would notice immediately if a gown went missing. But there, in the far corner where the unclaimed items languished, she spotted it, a dress of deep emerald green with delicate gold embroidery along the bodice. It had been hanging there for 3 weeks, abandoned after Lady Pembroke had deemed it hopelessly last season. Cora's fingers trembled as she reached for it. The fabric felt like water between her coal-roughened hands, so impossibly soft she was afraid her touch alone would ruin it. She bundled it quickly into a laundry sack, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. Getting the dress was only half the battle. The real challenge was reaching the ballroom without being stopped, questioned, or worse, recognized as the coal maid who had no business anywhere near the trial of merit. But Cora had spent 12 years working the palace's lowest levels, and she knew secrets that even the king's advisors had forgotten. Behind the third boiler in the eastern corridor, there was a servant's passage built centuries ago for discreet movement between floors. The entrance was hidden behind a loose stone that she'd discovered during a particularly brutal winter when she'd sought shelter from the biting cold. Now, dressed in the stolen gown with her dark hair pinned up in a style she'd practiced in secret, Cora pressed her palm against that same stone and felt it give way. The passage beyond was narrow and pitch black, but she'd walked it enough times to know every turn, every uneven step. She moved through the darkness like a ghost, one hand trailing along the damp wall, counting her steps. 63 paces forward. Turn left. 42 paces up the spiral stair. Turn right. She could hear music now, the soaring strings of a waltz filtering through the walls like a dream. Light seeped through the cracks in the hidden door ahead, golden and beckoning. Beyond it lay the grand ballroom where nobles already gathered like peacocks, preening and positioning themselves for the king's attention. Cora's hand found the concealed latch. One pull, and she would step from shadow into light, from servant to competitor, from invisible to seen. She took a breath, tasting perfume and possibility, then pushed the door open and stepped into a world that had never been meant for girls like her. The ballroom swallowed her whole, and there was no turning back. Cora had made it exactly 47 minutes in the ballroom before the walls began closing in. The other competitors moved through the space with practiced grace, their laughter crystalline and effortless, their conversations a dance she'd never learned the steps to. Every time someone's gaze lingered on her a moment too long, her heart seized with the certainty that they could see through the emerald silk to the coal dust still embedded beneath her fingernails. She needed air. She needed darkness. She needed anything but the suffocating brilliance of the chandeliers overhead. The garden doors stood open to the night, and Cora slipped through them like smoke, her stolen gown whispering against the marble tiles. The moon hung low and heavy over the palace gardens, illuminating paths that wound between rose bushes and marble fountains. She followed the darkest trail, seeking the shadowed places where no one would think to look for her. That's when she found him, or rather, when he found her. Running away already. The voice came from behind a towering hedge, startling her so badly she nearly tripped over her own hem. A figure emerged from the shadows, and her stomach dropped when moonlight caught the glint of his crown. I thought the evening had only just begun. King Alastair looked different up close, younger than he'd seemed from the balcony that afternoon. There were shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, and his formal jacket hung slightly loose on his frame, as though he'd recently lost weight. Cora's mind raced through a dozen appropriate responses, "Your Majesty, forgive me, or I was simply taking in the beauty of your gardens," but what came out instead was the truth. I needed to breathe. It's too bright in there. Too loud. Too many people pretending to be something they are not. A mistake. A terrible mistake. You didn't speak to kings like that. But Alastair's expression shifted into something that looked almost like relief. Finally. Someone honest. He moved closer, and she caught the scent of sandalwood and old books. Do you know how many women have told me tonight that my eyes rival the stars themselves? 3. 3 separate astronomical comparisons. Despite herself, Cora felt her lips twitch. That must be exhausting. You have no idea. He leaned against the fountain's edge, his posture relaxing in a way that seemed impossible for a king. Tell me something true. Why did you enter the trial? The question caught her off guard. She thought of Ilara's broken arm, of Guard Captain Thorne's contempt, of every invisible soul grinding themselves to dust beneath these glittering floors. Because someone I love was hurt, she said quietly. And the people who hurt her will never face consequences. Not unless someone changes things from the inside. Alistair studied her face in the moonlight, and something shifted in his expression, recognition, perhaps, or understanding. The coal dust rebellions in the Eastern District. The reports of workers collapsing from exhaustion. I've been trying to investigate, but my advisors insist everything is under control. Your advisors are lying. The words hung between them like a blade. I know, he said simply, and the exhaustion in his voice was so genuine it made her chest ache. That's why I need someone who'll tell me the truth. Even when it cuts. The banquet hall stretched before Cora like a minefield disguised as splendor. Crystal goblets caught the light of 1,000 candles, casting prismatic rainbows across damask tablecloth so white they seemed to glow. She'd polished these very floors countless times, crawling on her hands and knees in the pre-dawn darkness. Now she sat at the table itself, surrounded by women in silks and jewels, each one watching the others with the cold calculation of hawks circling prey. This was the first official test of the trial, a formal dinner where King Alistair would observe how each competitor carried herself in the refined atmosphere of court. Cora's chair was positioned directly across from his, a placement that felt both like an honor and a trap. The first course arrived on silver platters, a delicate consommé served in bowls so thin she could see her distorted reflection in the amber liquid. Cora watched the woman to her left, Lady Vivienne of House Ashworth, lift her spoon with practiced elegance, bringing it to her lips without making a sound. Simple enough. But when Cora reached for her own spoon, her hands betrayed her. The silver felt wrong in her palm, too light, too refined. She was accustomed to rough wooden handles and tin cups, to eating standing up in stolen moments between shifts. The spoon trembled slightly as she lifted it, and a single drop of consommé fell back into the bowl with an audible splash. Lady Vivienne's eyes flickered toward her, lips curving into the ghost of a smile. The second course was worse, quail glazed in honey and thyme, requiring the use of 3 different utensils that Cora couldn't distinguish from one another. She watched the others, trying to mirror their movements, but her coal-stained fingers felt massive and clumsy against the delicate silverware. Despite scrubbing her hands raw for an hour before the dinner, faint traces of black still lined the creases of her palms, dark crescents beneath her nails that no amount of soap could reach. She kept her hands in her lap as much as possible, reaching for her glass or fork only when absolutely necessary. But across the table, she could feel Alistair's gaze on her, steady and searching. "Tell me, Lady Cora," came a syrupy voice from her right. Duchess Seraphine, a woman whose age was impossible to determine beneath layers of powder and rouge. "What does your family's estate specialize in? Agriculture? Trade?" The table went quiet. Even the servants paused in their choreographed movements around the room. Cora's mind raced. She could lie, invent some distant manor house, some fictional vineyard or textile business. But Alistair was watching, and she remembered his words in the garden, "I need someone who'll tell me the truth." She set down her fork and met the Duchess's eyes directly, her coal-stained hands now visible on the white tablecloth like an accusation. "Survival," Cora said quietly. "My family specializes in survival." The silence that followed was deafening. But when she finally dared to look across the table, Alistair wasn't looking at her hands. He was smiling. The ring had been a mistake. Cora realized it the moment Duke Vane's gaze locked onto her hand during the afternoon promenade through the palace rose gardens. She'd been careful to keep it hidden beneath gloves most of the time, but the unseasonable heat had forced her to remove them, and now the diamond caught the sunlight like a beacon, throwing fractured rainbows across the marble path. Duke Vane was a tall man with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes the color of winter ice. He carried himself with the kind of authority that came not from a crown, but from decades of accumulating power in the shadows behind it. As the king's chief advisor and distant cousin, he was the second most powerful man in the Ivory Peaks, and the most dangerous. "What an exquisite ring," he said, his voice smooth as poisoned honey. He'd materialized beside her so quietly she hadn't heard his approach. "May I?" It wasn't really a question. Before Cora could pull away, his fingers closed around her wrist with surprising strength, tilting her hand toward the light. His expression remained pleasant, conversational, but his grip was iron. "Fascinating," he murmured, his thumb brushing over the stone. "The cut is quite unusual. Old-fashioned, really. Pre-Reformation era, if I'm not mistaken." His eyes lifted to hers, and there was something predatory in them now. "Where did you say your family was from?" "I didn't." Cora pulled her hand free, her heart hammering. "It was my grandmother's." "How sentimental." Duke Vane smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You know, there's a rather interesting piece of royal history involving a ring very much like that one. The Heart of the Peaks, they called it. It disappeared 23 years ago during the succession crisis, along with the king's infant niece." He paused, letting the words settle like stones in deep water. Of course, everyone assumed both were lost forever. The garden suddenly felt too bright, too exposed. Other competitors strolled past them in pairs and trios, their laughter floating on the breeze, completely unaware of the knife's edge Cora was balanced on. "That must have been terrible," Cora managed, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Losing a child." "Oh, devastating," Vane agreed, still watching her with those calculating eyes. "Though wonders wonder, if the ring survived, perhaps the child did as well. Imagine the chaos that would create. A hidden heir with a legitimate claim to the throne raised in obscurity, suddenly appearing during a trial to choose the king's consort." He tilted his head, studying her like a specimen under glass. "It would be quite the scandal, wouldn't it?" Cora felt the blood drain from her face, but she held his gaze. "It would also be quite the coincidence." "Indeed." Duke Vane's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "I've never been fond of coincidences, Lady Cora. They have a tendency to unravel when you pull the right thread." He bowed with exaggerated courtesy and walked away, leaving Cora standing frozen among the roses. He knew. Or at least, he suspected. And now the hunt had begun. The library was Cora's refuge from the suffocating scrutiny of the trial. While other competitors primped and schemed in their lavish chambers, she retreated here after dinner, seeking solace among the leather-bound volumes and the familiar scent of old paper. It reminded her of the few stolen moments in her childhood when she'd learned to read by candlelight, tracing words in books borrowed from sympathetic kitchen maids. She didn't hear Alistair enter. One moment she was alone with a volume of poetry, and the next he was standing in the doorway, his crown conspicuously absent, his formal jacket replaced by a simple linen shirt. "I hoped I'd find you here," he said softly. "Everyone else is at the music salon, competing to see who can play the most complicated sonata." He moved closer, and the candlelight carved shadows across his face. "But you're reading poetry in the dark." "It's not completely dark." Cora closed the book, suddenly aware of how intimate this felt, just the two of them in a room built for whispers and secrets. "And I never learned to play an instrument." "Neither did I, actually." Alistair settled into the chair beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "My tutors focused on warfare and statecraft. They said music was a frivolous distraction." He paused, his voice dropping lower. "They were wrong about a lot of things." The vulnerability in his words made her chest tighten. This close, she could see the exhaustion etched into his features, the weight of a crown he'd inherited too young from a father who died in scandal and debt. "Alistair," she began, and the use of his name without title made them both still. "There's something I need to tell you." "About who I really?" The scream shattered the moment like glass. It came from somewhere above them, high and piercing, a woman's voice raised in terror or outrage. Alastair was on his feet instantly, his hand instinctively reaching for a sword he wasn't wearing. Cora followed him as he rushed toward the sound, her heart already sinking with a dread she couldn't name. They found the source in the corridor outside the Queen's treasury, a small, secured room where the crown jewels were kept. Lady Vivienne stood there in her nightgown, her face pale and shocked, pointing at the open door with a trembling hand. "Thief!" she gasped. "I heard noises and came to investigate. The treasury has been breached." Guards materialized from every direction, their boots thundering on marble. And then Duke Vane appeared, moving through the chaos with unsettling calm, his eyes finding Cora immediately. "Lady Cora," he said, his voice carrying over the commotion. "How curious to find you so close to the scene. And is that," he gestured to her hand, "dust on your fingers? The same black residue found on the treasury lock." Cora looked down. Her hands, which had been clean moments ago in the library, were now smudged with what looked unmistakably like coal dust. She'd been set up. The guards closed in like wolves, their hands already reaching for her arms. Cora's mind raced through her options, all of them terrible. She could protest her innocence, but the evidence was literally on her hands. She could demand a fair trial, but Duke Vane controlled the courts. She could appeal to Alastair, but even he looked uncertain now, his eyes flickering between her coal-stained fingers and the ransacked treasury. In that split second, Cora made a choice that would either save her or condemn her completely. She ran. Not toward the grand hallways where more guards would be waiting, but toward the servants' entrance she'd spotted earlier, a narrow door hidden behind a tapestry that led to the service passages only the palace staff knew existed. She heard Alastair shout her name, heard the thunder of boots behind her, but she was already through the door and plunging into the darkness beyond. These tunnels were her territory. While nobles waltzed in ballrooms, she'd spent 12 years crawling through these veins of the palace, learning every shortcut, every forgotten passage, every chimney shaft that connected the lower levels to the royal chambers above. The guards would get lost in minutes. But Cora could navigate them blind. She kicked off her silk slippers and ran barefoot, her stolen gown hitched up around her knees. Left at the second junction. Down the spiral stairs. Through the laundry chute that hadn't been used in decades. The sounds of pursuit faded behind her, swallowed by stone and distance. But running wasn't enough. She needed proof, real proof that would expose Duke Vane's manipulation. And suddenly, she knew exactly where to find it. The Duke's private study was 3 floors above her current position, accessible only through the main palace corridors. But Cora knew something the architects had forgotten: the old chimney system connected every major room in the eastern wing, including the study. The chimneys had been sealed off decades ago when the palace switched to a modern heating system, but the shafts themselves remained, narrow and treacherous and perfect for someone small and desperate enough to climb them. She found the access point behind the kitchen ovens, a grate she'd cleaned 100 times. Her hands, already stained with the Duke's planted evidence, found holes in the rough stone. She climbed in darkness, her muscles screaming, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Coal dust and old soot rained down on her face, mixing with sweat, transforming her back into what she'd always been, a girl covered in grime, invisible and overlooked. 20 feet up. 30. Her fingers found the grate to the Duke's study and she pushed, praying it wasn't locked from the inside. It gave way with a groan of protesting metal. Cora pulled herself through and collapsed onto the plush carpet of Duke Vane's private sanctuary, her elegant gown now torn and blackened beyond recognition. She had minutes, maybe less, before someone found her. She'd better make them count. Duke Vane's desk was a monument to controlled chaos, stacks of correspondence arranged with military precision, ledgers bound in leather, and a locked drawer that practically screamed its importance. Cora's fingers, already expert from years of picking coal cellar locks for forgotten tools, made quick work of it. Inside, she found exactly what she needed: financial records showing systematic embezzlement from the Workers' Relief Fund, forged signatures authorizing the sale of grain meant for the poor, and most damning of all, a letter in the Duke's own hand detailing his plan to eliminate the coal-made pretender before she could threaten his position as the power behind the throne. She stuffed the documents into her bodice just as voices echoed in the hallway outside. The final day of the trial dawned with cruel irony, a celebration in the grand courtyard where King Alastair would announce his chosen consort. Cora was dragged there in chains, still covered in soot from her chimney escape, the stolen documents hidden against her heart. The remaining competitors stood in a pristine line, their gowns shimmering in the morning sun, while she knelt in the dirt like a criminal awaiting execution. The crowd had swelled to hundreds, nobles, servants, merchants, all come to witness either a coronation or a condemnation. Cora spotted Ilara in the servants' section, her friend's face pale with terror. She spotted Bess and the other coal maids, their expressions caught between hope and heartbreak. Duke Vane stood beside the king's throne, triumphant. "Your Majesty," he announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "before you make your choice, the people deserve to know the truth about one of your competitors." He gestured, and a servant brought forward a wooden bucket. Even from a distance, Cora could smell it, coal dust, freshly ground, the scent of her entire life. "This woman," Vane continued, circling her like a predator, "has deceived us all. She is no lady. She is coal cellar trash who infiltrated this sacred trial through theft and deception." He lifted the bucket high. "Let us reveal her true nature." The coal dust hit her like a black wave, covering her face, her hair, her torn gown. It filled her mouth and nose, the taste of it familiar and suffocating. The crowd gasped. Some of the noble ladies actually screamed, as if poverty itself might be contagious. Cora didn't try to wipe it away. Instead, she rose to her feet, chains clinking, and met Alastair's eyes across the courtyard. His face was unreadable, frozen between shock and something else she couldn't name. "He's right," she said, her voice steady despite the coal dust coating her tongue. "I am coal cellar trash. I've spent 12 years breaking my back to keep this palace warm while people like him," she pointed at Vane with her chained hands, "stole the bread from our children's mouths." She pulled the documents from her bodice, now smudged but still legible, and held them high. "And I have proof." The documents passed from hand to hand like wildfire, first to Alastair, then to his captain of the guard, then to the magistrate who'd been summoned in haste. Duke Vane's face transformed from triumph to fury to naked fear in the span of 3 heartbeats. He lunged for Cora, but guards intercepted him, their swords drawn and gleaming in the sun. "Lies!" Vane snarled, struggling against their grip. "Forgeries created by a desperate thief." "They bear your seal," Alastair said quietly, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk. He stood now, the documents clutched in his hand, his face carved from stone. "Your signature. Your handwriting." He looked up at the crowd, then at Cora, still kneeling in chains and coal dust. "And she risked everything to bring them to light." The king descended from his throne and crossed the courtyard. The crowd held its collective breath. Cora's heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. This was the moment. He could still condemn her for the deception, for the stolen gown, for daring to reach above her station. Alastair knelt in the dirt beside her, heedless of his ceremonial robes, and with his own hands, unlocked her chains. "You asked me once what I was looking for in a consort," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I said I wanted someone who understood the struggles of our people. Someone who would tell me the truth, even when it cuts." He took her coal-blackened hand in his. "I found more than that. I found someone brave enough to fight for those who have no voice. Someone who wore the dirt of her labor like armor and refused to be ashamed of it." He stood, pulling her up with him, and addressed the crowd. "Cora Lowen has won the trial of merit, not through flattery or noble blood, but through courage and truth. And more than that," he held up her hand, the ring catching the light, "she is the lost heir of House Lowen, rightful claimant to the Eastern Peaks, returned to us after 23 years. The crowd erupted. Some in celebration, some in shock, some in outrage that a coal maid could be nobility. But Cora barely heard them. She was looking at Ilara, at Bess, at all the workers who'd spent their lives invisible and exhausted, and she saw hope blazing in their eyes like a newborn sun. 3 weeks later, the coronation ceremony made history. Cora wasn't crowned as a consort, a decorative wife to stand beside the throne. Alastair insisted she be crowned High Queen in her own right, a co-ruler with equal power and authority. She wore a gown of midnight blue embroidered with coal-black thread, a deliberate choice that made the nobles whisper and the workers weep with pride. And when the crown was placed on her head, her first decree was simple but revolutionary. Open the palace gates. Let the workers enter. Let them see that these halls belong to them as much as to any noble. Let them know they are invisible no more. The gate swung open, and the people flooded in, coal maids and kitchen servants, blacksmiths and laundresses, all the invisible souls who'd kept the ivory peaks running while the nobility danced above their heads. Cora stood on the balcony beside Alastair, her hand in his, and watched as the palace transformed. Workers marveled at the chandeliers they'd polished in darkness. Children ran laughing through corridors they'd only glimpsed through cracks in doors. And in the grand ballroom where she'd once felt so out of place, Elara danced with her arm in a sling, her face radiant with joy. "No more shadows," Cora whispered. Alastair squeezed her hand. "No more shadows," he agreed. The coalmaid had become a queen. But more importantly, she'd ensured that every coalmaid after her would know they could be queens too. The ivory peaks would never be the same. And that, Cora thought as the sun set over her kingdom, was exactly the point.